Today is a venture into the problem of memory, the differences between history and memory, where memory begins in our neuroscience. I'm not a neuroscientist. I just sometimes read them. There's a character in Plato's Republic. You may or may not remember reading that. His name is Glaucon. At one point he tells Socrates that people would behave ethically only if they thought they were being watched. And there are neuroscientists who have said, Glaucon got it right. Are we ethical only when we're monitored? Do our brains work toward the good, the honest and the true, whatever, even the altruistic when we're watched? Is that why we have law? Because these human creatures are not. I mean, that's a cynical view, isn't it, of Glaucon? But was he right? Now, memory is arguably our most powerful human capacity. Think about it for a moment. We are the only species that we know of that can actually know its own history. Now, there may be some that can. We haven't come to understand it yet in all of our powers. But we're the only species that can know its own past, know that it knows its own past, and write it up and accumulate it in huge libraries. No other species does that we know of. Dolphins, maybe they have an archive way deep in the ocean. We haven't found it yet. Stephen Jay Gould, the great paleontologist, evolutionary biologist, now gone, wrote book after book after book about evolution, was once sitting in the Vatican. This, Jewish American evolutionary biologist was at some big conference in Rome, and he went over to, maybe you've been to St. Peter's, and you sit in that dome and you realize, whoa, man. He sat, and this was during the brinksmanship of the 1980s, the nuclear brinksmanship of the 1980s, between, Brezhnev and Reagan. Those were past presidents of two world powers in a decade previous to this century. But I think he was there at a nuclear, non-proliferation conference or something. But what I remember about what he wrote about was amazing. He said, here I sit in this most magnificent edifice of the oldest institution in Western civilization. Now, you might get an argument on that, but the Catholic Church. And we humans have the capacity to destroy all creation, all memory. How can that be? Well, presumably because our reason, our logic, our scientific quest figured out how to split the atom, how to do nuclear fusion, how to create nuclear fuel, how to test it, and how to make it into a bomb, big bombs, huge bombs. You ever been in any place like that where you at least take the time to reflect about the whole species? We don't take that kind of time very often. Who's got time to think about the whole species? Hard enough to think about ourselves in relation to the next terrible crises we're in. But let me reflect with you just for a moment on what neuroscientists are doing with this. And again, I am no neuroscientist. So those of you who are, correct me later. Don't embarrass me right away, but embarrass me later. There's a really cool new book out, brand new, from Yale University Press called Why We Remember. It's by a neuroscientist, cognitive scientist named Sharan Raghunath. Amazing book, where he takes you through several chapters. He's trying to write it for laymen, and I understood some of it. He's writing it for laymen about how this thing works called memory. How do we remember? Why do we remember? Why is this capacity in us so powerful, and why is its loss so terrifying? He says that we are essentially programmed to forget more than remember. And that forgetting is one of the ways we survive, we endure, we sometimes can control the passions that might overwhelm us, make us kill somebody or do whatever. Literal recall, he shows, and this is, of course, you might sort of understand this by intuition already, whatever that is, but literal recall is almost totally irrelevant. How many times in a single day, though, do you say, I vividly remember? Oh, I remember. Do you? How many times have you told that story, that really special, cool story? I once struck out Steve Garvey in an inter-squad game. I know you don't know who Steve Garvey is, maybe, but he's actually running for the U.S. Senate right now in California against Adam Schiff. And he's become a right-wing Republican. Steve was always kind of over there somewhere. But Steve was a great baseball player. Many, many years in the majors. He probably should be in the Hall of Fame. We were on the same baseball team at Michigan State. And all we ever did in fall practice is play inter-squad games. And the regular hitters were not allowed to make an out. They either hit or got on, and they stayed there no matter how many times you walked them. But finally, after probably walking them 3 times, I struck them out on a slider in the dirt. And I've never forgotten, I struck out Steve Garvey. At least I think I did. I've told that so many times, though, I really wonder now. How does memory get triggered for you? God knows, all kinds of ways. Sounds, smells, sights, taste. The smell and taste of garlic, where does it take you? A face. God, I know that person. Where do I know her from? You know, how many times a day do you do that? All the time. Or I should know that person. Or damn, why can't I? How about a word? You hear a word, it just triggers something, takes you somewhere. Takes you home, maybe. I can hear a Midwestern accent sometimes. Tim Walsh's accent takes me home to my uncles. For better or worse, they didn't quite have his politics, my uncles. How about the lyric of a song? Song lyrics are one of the most, especially in the modern era, one of the most powerful triggers of memory. I can hear 2 chords of a Springsteen song and I'm somewhere right away. Various places. Born. I'm already somewhere. In the U.S. This guy in this book, Why We Remember, says, memory is like an invisible hand that guides our lives. We don't even know it much of the time. He also shows us, as so much neuroscience has, that memory is almost completely malleable. We like our memories to sit still, don't we? Come on, sit down. Stop changing. Stay there. Because I remember that. But every time we have a memory, we actually are remaking it, according to the neuroscience. And they have all this MRI evidence for this now, folks. They've been doing this since, this has really been revolutionized since the 1990s. When I got into studying collective memory, social memory, Civil War memory, et cetera, I started getting invited once in a while to these conferences on memory, which were all organized by neuroscientists. I had no idea what they were talking about, but they wanted one or two token historians who could come and talk about social memory. They'd put us kind of on the end after they would do all their data study after data study after data study. Amazing stuff. And what they were finding is that memories are really copies of a copy 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 of a copy. That's kind of disconcerting in a way, isn't it? Come on. I got to have some memories of memories of your mother. Ralph Waldo Emerson once wrote, Emerson wrote about everything, as some of you may know, and he wrote an essay on memory. It's a lovely, wonderful little essay on memory, and among other things he says in it, we remember at the extremes. Emerson wasn't a neuroscientist now, but he said, we remember at the extremes. Remember the things we love the most and the things we hate the most. All the rest in that middle is life, the rest of our life. This all happens, though, because of neural connections. There's a hippocampus in the middle of your brain. They say it's shaped like a seahorse. I don't know, but that's what they say. I've never seen one. I hope they never have to see mine. But in that hippocampus, which is right in the middle of your brain, is where most memory is at least stored. So that's what was always believed. Had to be. It's the deep part of the brain. And it seemed to be the central headquarters of memory, the archive. You ever use the metaphor for your brain and your memory? Like my files aren't coming through today for me. That must be in the next file, the next file, the next file, file. But now they have a lot of research that says the frontal cortex, the front of your brain, actually is very involved in memory and may be the kind of sorting out place. And you may not even care about this. Where does memory act? This is what neuroscientists get multi-million-dollar grants to study. They're trying to locate everything in the brain. It happens here, and here, and a little bit here. I mean, it does make you in awe. It makes me in awe. This thing we all have. This magnificent thing. This human brain that we got and the other animals didn't. It's been estimated that there are about 86 billion neurons. I don't know what that means. In that gray matter circling the interior of your brain, protecting it. Well, the skull protects it, but so does that gray matter. 86 billion neurons. And many of those neurons have only one connection to something else. One purpose. Well, what the hell do all the rest of them do? Now, I want you to think a little bit more about this, and then I'll leave it and go to the question of social collective memory, which is where this business of why universities would study their past, why, peoples, why churches, why neighborhoods, why anybody, nations will study their past and go figure it out and try to put it into a story. That's our main subject. But there's some writers worth knowing on this, namely Daniel Kahneman. Some of you may indeed be familiar with Daniel Kahneman because he wrote a massive bestseller. He just died recently, great psychologist, although he won the Nobel Prize in economic science because he wrote about almost everything. But his roots are in neuroscience and psychology. Daniel Kahneman wrote a book, Thinking Fast and Slow. I mean, it was like bestseller list for 6 years or something. He wrote for normal people. And I can read some of him. And God, is he good. He helps us understand, well, whether you fully buy it all. He created this theory he called System 1 and System 2 thinking. You can like it or hate it. System 1 is our intuition. System 1 is fast. It's our reactions. It's our emotions. It's kind of unreasoned. It's like our first reactions. You see a car accident, you have an immediate reaction. You see a friend, you have an immediate reaction. You hear an idea, you have an immediate reaction. We do. We have an instinctive reaction. That's System 1 thinking. It's where passion lies, and probably even unreason, but it's our initial reaction. This is based on loads and loads and loads and loads of MRI research, how people react. The second system, System 2 thinking, is slower. It's reasoning. It's reflection. Kahneman goes on to argue it's lazier. Oh, I need to think about that. Or as my British friends always say, let me give that a think. I like that phrase. I'm going to give it a think. It might take 10 days giving that a think. This is our rationality, our reason, our analytical capacities. This is where we have some rules to follow. Logic, evidence, research. In my field, we have some serious rules. What you can do and not do. Now, they have evidence, and this is a big debate in neuroscience, I'm told, or I've read, that possibly as much as, this is scary to me, possibly as much as 80% of our thinking comes in System 1. Let's say it's 70, that's still pretty scary. If 70 or 80% of our thinking is System 1 thinking, instinct, reaction, unreason, passion, and 20 or 30% is rationality and reason and logic and reflection that takes time, slow thought, how does that fit our world? How many times a day do you get to just slow down and reflect? I had a professor in graduate school, Paul Kunkin. God bless him, bless his soul. This guy taught intellectual history, a giant in American intellectual history. If you're looking him up, you'll see lots and lots of books. Paul used to say his office hours were all day. Well, this was sort of intimidating, to say the least, if you want to come. And Paul would always have note cards. We used to use note cards for research. He'd have note cards all over his desk and adjoining tables, and you'd just go in, professor, hello. He'd stop working. He'd talk with you. But he had a saying that for every hour you spend reading, graduate student, you should spend at least, come on back. Come on. Sorry, what do I hit? Not laptop. No, I'm hitting projector on. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Carl's back there working it. All right. Anyway. 1 hour you spend reading, spend 1 hour in reflection. You're telling that to a wildly busy graduate student who can't get his reading done. Sure, professor, but damned if that guy didn't do it. Do you spend 1 hour reflecting for every hour you spend reading? Do you spend 1 hour reflecting for every hour you spend right here? I don't. We live in a world now that is so fast, right? We're bombarded by media, bombarded by ideas, bombarded by information. And here there's neuroscientists telling us that we should slow down. We should just slow down. Just slow down. Okay, there are other writers. Jonathan Haidt has taken the Kahneman thesis and taken it to even other distances. There's a whole lot of other writers. Jonathan Haidt wrote a remarkable book, debated much, called The Righteous Mind. In it, he says, in effect, instinct rules us. System one thinking rules us, and our reason is really just our lawyer or our press secretary that do the spin for us. Because instinct is in charge. Passion and instinct and emotion are really in charge. And Jonathan Haidt wrote his book, Righteous Mind, aiming it at politics. He said, you want to affect elections? You want to go out and campaign and win? Make it emotional. I mean, we kind of know that. And Vice President Harris is running a campaign now that is about fun and loving your country. With some Beyonce in the background. And sometimes people are saying, well, wait a minute, give us a little more substance here, give me a little more. And, yeah, I suppose they will. But is reason, as David Hume, a philosopher people don't necessarily like anymore, but is reason, as David Hume once wrote, the slave of passion? Oh, no? Okay. Did I hit something? Maybe I did. I'm so sorry. I don't. Anyway. All right. Enough of the neuroscientist, perhaps, for the moment. Sorry. I'm fascinated with what they do, partly because it's new to me. You know, okay, we'll get to a few pictures in a minute. Thinking Fast and Slow was a revelation to me. You must experience this when you actually get to, whether it's attending a lecture or reading a book, somebody says, you should read this. And it's totally new to you. I love that. I don't get that very often because I have way too much to read that I have to read. I can't get that read. But when I can actually go read something that's really new, and it makes me think differently, makes me go into my system two thinking. At least have a visit till I get thrown back out because I looked up a baseball score. Oh, shit, you know. All right. What happens when memory becomes blank? No. Guys have lost the pictures somehow. I don't know. Anyway, what happens when memory becomes something we do in groups? How do groups remember? Well, they remember by telling stories. They remember by narratives. They remember by the stories they tell each other. And a group becomes a group when they can find reasonable or emotional agreement on that memory. There are differences between history and memory, and I'm going to get to that in a second. But some of my favorite philosophers, well, in fact, every philosopher has written about memory. I don't know if anybody's a major in philosophy. Every philosopher has written about memory. Every novelist writes about memory. What do they have? But memory, to begin with. Now, historical novelists go out and do research, too. But they still got some of themselves in it. Historians do this too. We have a whole bunch of other rules to follow. Pierre Nora, a French historian back in the 70s who wrote a series of books called Lieux de Mémoire, which means places of memory. Nora was all bent out of shape because the French weren't going to their monuments. And he thought they should be visiting Napoleon's tomb and all the great monuments and the commemorative sites of French history. They were losing it. They were losing hold of the French Revolution. They didn't even know who they were anymore, those French people. They'd lost the Catholic Church because nobody went anymore. They had Notre Dame, which all the world wanted to see, but nobody went to church. So Nora wrote this incredible work of scholarship called Lieux de Mémoire, Places of Memory. Why places sometimes are how we remember. A place makes us think back makes us connect with this part of the story and that part of the story, and then we add to the story. But Nara said, memory dictates, but history just writes. And he got all kind of crazy and worried that historians were just carving away the depth of social memory. People were losing their churches and losing their clubs and their bowling alley. He didn't write Bowling Alone. That came from an American named Putman later. But you know, the French just didn't know who they were anymore. They had nothing to tie them down. And historians were just writing all this social history about forces in the past. And there weren't any events anymore. He was really a mess. But he inspired a whole lot of people to study this thing called memory. I was in the History and Memory Working Group at Harvard way back in the early 90s, which is partly where I got interested in memory. And the first reading we did was Pierre Nora's initial article on lieu de mémoire. My favorite writer on memory is one of the oldest, St. Augustine, in the 3rd century, 4th century. In the Confessions, Augustine has about a 30 to 40 page section on the nature of memory. That's a work of theology, of course, but he has a whole section on what memory might actually be, partly because he's terrified that God knows his memory. Knows what he's done. Augustine says, "Great is the power of memory. It's a fearful thing. Oh my God, a deep and boundless manifoldness, and this thing is the mind, and this am I myself." It's Augustine coming to his conclusion that he is his memory. You are your memory. You cease to be fully human without it. You may not know who you are without it. Now, then there's Mark Twain. Yeah, you're already chuckling. Why not? Twain warned us about memory. He said, when I was young, I could remember everything, whether it happened or not. But now that I'm old, I remember only the things that never happened. I'm sorry if that had a little resonance. Everybody's written about memory. Memory can become, of course, when it mixes with history, very sentimental. It can become very nostalgic. This is where the collision of history and memory get to be troublesome, but fascinating and necessary. But sometimes, what do we do with the mix of memory and history? Well, we make history fit memory. You want to find a story you want to live in? You want to find a story you believe in? You want to find a story with good ancestors who did good in the world. Who didn't want to live? Who didn't want a grandfather who saved the world somehow? I'll tell you how I learned what my German-born grandfather actually did in World War I. God, I was not there for that, but I was. But we can get very sentimental about what gets remembered and how it gets tied to how we view history. One of my very favorite examples is this, and I'm going to read the quote. It comes from the great William James, the great American philosopher of the late 19th, early 20th century. He wrote a now famous essay called The Moral Equivalent of War. He wrote it in 1910, just before he died. He had become by then a very active member of the American Anti-Imperialist Society. James had always struggled with his views on war and how his brothers had gone to serve in the Civil War and he had not. Here's what he said, warning us about what we, the country, had done with the memory of the Civil War by 1910. Quote, There is something highly paradoxical in the modern man's relation to war. Ask all our millions, north or south, whether they would vote now, were such a thing possible, to have our war for the Union expunged from history, and the record of a peaceful transition to the present time substituted for that of its marches and battles. And probably hardly a handful of eccentrics would ever say yes. Those ancestors, those efforts, those memories, those legends, and the most ideal part of what we now own together, a sacred spiritual possession worth more than all the blood poured out. He says, ironically. Yet ask those same people whether they would be willing in cold blood to start another civil war now to gain another similar possession. And not one man or woman would vote for the proposition. In modern eyes, precious though wars may be, they must not be waged solely for the sake of the ideal harvest. Only when forced upon one, only when an enemy's injustice leaves us no alternative is war now thought permissible. And that's before World War I broke out. All those people out there yearning for a civil war. Oh, we might be on the verge of a new civil war. I'm going to take up that question on Thursday, so I'll be quiet about it now. Should read William James. History and memory. History, this is my argument, is what trained historians do. It's a reasoned reconstruction of the past rooted in research. It tends to be critical and skeptical of human motives and action, and therefore it is more secular than what people commonly refer to as memory. History can be read by or belong to everyone. It assesses change and progress over time and is therefore more relative, more contingent upon things like place, chronology, scale. Memory, however, is often treated as a sacred set of potentially absolute meanings. Or stories. Don't tell me what happened to D-Day. My grandfather did. Oh, really? How much did your grandfather actually see that day? Memory is often owned. History gets interpreted. Memory is passed down through generations. History gets revised. Memory often coalesces around objects and sacred sites and monuments. History seeks to understand contexts and complexity of cause and effect. That's why it's slower. History asserts the authority of academic training, those elitists who are always supposed to be on the coast. There are no elitists in Michigan or Minnesota, apparently. And it's run by canons of evidence, for God's sake. Memory, though, carries the often more powerful authority, System 1 thinking, of community membership. It's my community's story. It's my people's story. You can't have it, and you will not tell it. I don't care how much research you do. Now, one of the best ways to understand what we do with history and memory, or what memory ultimately is just to realize it's not rocket science, it's stories. It's story. And you know, one of the best books ever written on story is by a screenwriter. Do you know the book by Robert McKee? It's called Story. How to Do Screenwriting. Anybody planning to become an unemployed screenwriter? I have a nephew in California. He's in his 30s now. And he has 2 day jobs, but he's still trying to be a screenwriter. God bless him. He's brilliant. But anyway, stories, not just that make good melodrama, but it's how we use truth and reality to make sense of it all. Time itself can seem like tyranny. It can seem like anarchy. How do you understand time? How do you control time? Where's time going? So is our existence. Story is the way we make sense of the anarchy of time. McKee says the art of story is the dominant cultural force in the world. And I quote him further. McKee says, quote, "Story is not only our most prolific art form, but rivals all activities, work, play, eating, exercise, for our working hours. We tell and take in stories as much as we sleep, and even then, we dream." Some neuroscientists have concluded that we spend 40%, I don't know how they got to this number, don't ask me, 40% at least of all of our waking hours and unwaking hours involved in storytelling, one way or another. You're going to go to lunch with your friends. You're going to tell stories about something. It may be dull and boring, it may be exciting, you just ran into somebody, you just came out of this lecture, I didn't know what the hell it was about, but it was kind of interesting. Memory, collective memory, is about forging those stories that we live in, that we define ourselves with, that we build identity around. And then they compete. And do they compete? And that's where the politics comes. And oh, is memory full of politics? One passage on that. There's I have it up here, I think. There's a brilliant book called The Ethics of Memory by Avishai Margalit, a philosopher. I teach this course every time I do a seminar about history and memory. Apologies to anyone who took the seminar, you had to read this book. But Margalit is about trying to figure out, to the extent we can use System 2 memory, thinking, can we be moral about it? Can we develop an ethics? Can we develop a morality about how we use the past, our past, anyone's past, that makes us behave better? And of course, Margalit comes out of the tradition of, he's an Israeli philosopher by roots, and he comes out of the tradition of studying the Holocaust, or at least asking questions from the experience of the Holocaust. And among the many things he says in this brilliant little book is this: why ought humanity to remember moral nightmares rather than moments of human triumph? Think about this now in terms of universities. Why should we go there and want to know this and that and go deeper and find that and that and that about this institution or any institution, about your own country? Why dig all that up? Believe me, you get asked that when you're studying things like slavery at a university. Moments in which human beings behaved nobly. Why don't we just look for the noble? In the state of Florida, that's kind of what teaching is supposed to be now. Of course there is something good and endearing. I'm quoting Margalit. Something good and endearing in us, humans, all over the world, remembering such glorious events and the people who were involved in them. There is heroism in history. There is. There are people who reached for the good and changed the world. But the issue for us to sort out, says Margalit, is what humanity ought to remember, rather than what it is good for humanity to remember. Ought. You should study this because it's an ought, not because it's a good. And sometimes, people like me who study slavery all their lives, or people who study the Holocaust, or people who study inequality and 100 other issues, sometimes do wonder, God, why couldn't I just study the presidency? Well, there's some, skullduggery there too. What should humanity ought remember? All right, well, why are universities doing this now? What is the politics of this problem of the past at university? Now, you all know this. Those of you who are undergraduates, you just got here in the last 1, 2, 3 or so years by that process of admissions. Think of all those university view books you looked at. Everybody is beautiful and smiling, and they live in the multicultural dreamland of American universities, and they're all preparing to rule the world. Some of you are. This idyllic settings. There are always photographs taken in spring. And you get all those wonderful stories of all the famous people who went to this college and the resources for this and the resources for, right? Universities don't tell the terrible parts about themselves when they're promoting themselves. Of course they don't. Does your family do that? Family doesn't do that either until somebody kind of makes them because they went off and did Ancestry.com and they, oh, God. Mom, sorry, but I got to tell you about your dad or whatever. Do families do this? Not very easily, not very well, but they are doing it. Institutions have stories. Yale has a whole hell of a lot of stories and songs to go with it. Hey, I went to Michigan State. Sorry, I'm a Midwestern, I'm a Big Ten guy. I went to Michigan State. And when that idiot shot 3 students on the Michigan State campus a year ago, I was torn apart. So I wanted to go find that guy. I don't go there anymore. I haven't been there in a long, I have 2 degrees from there. And now they've found me and making me come back and give all kinds of talks and stuff. But I had an identity tied. I took classes in the very building he shot everybody in. And that wasn't very rational for me to get all upset about that, was it? No, it wasn't. But you can love Yale, mostly, probably. You're going to have days when you don't. I've had to give a lot of talks to Yale alumni because of this book in part, but there's a lot of Yale love out there. Oh my God. Woo. But they want to know this story, at least the ones who come to the talks. They really do. Because they did have their System 2 thinking affected while they were here, apparently. I don't know. Why are universities doing this? Many, many reasons. Many reasons are historical. I have 5 minutes or 6, I think, don't I? Another brilliant book, I was going to assign it, but you got enough to read probably. If you don't, just let me know. It's called The Age of Fracture by Daniel Rogers, a former professor of mine, a great, great cultural historian. He took up the 25-year period down to when he published the book, which was in 2011. This is before Trumpism. This is in the middle of the Obama presidency. Nothing you're living through right now seems to have happened yet. But he studied the previous 25 years, and he says America is in an era of an age of fracture. Its institutions are fracturing. Its churches are fracturing. Its visions of education are fracturing. It's fracturing over race. It's fracturing over gender. It's fracturing over LGBTQ rights. It's fracturing over region. It's fracturing over urban and rural, and a host of other things. It's a brilliant analysis that only Dan could do. But it's all done even before we got to. We weren't even calling ourselves polarized yet in 2011. Now you wake up every day and decide your quotient of polarization today. Oh, I'm at about 82%. An age of disaggregation, he said. Our institution, well, and he has a lot of political analysis. How much is our Constitution truly functioning right now? What parts of our Constitution don't function very well? Several. Then you had the end of the Cold War. Actually, back up a little more. The 1990s was where most, not all, of our current culture wars really blossomed? I don't know if emerged. They really did, over all kinds of things, from multiculturalism to the national history standards to how to commemorate and exhibit the Enola Gay airplane at the National Air and Space Museum, which was a huge brouhaha in the late 90s. All kinds of studies done of curriculum that divided people all over the country about how history was being taught in particular. One history war after another began to happen and happen and happen. Race and gender at the heart of it. I do a course here, a seminar, undergrad seminar. I'm doing it next semester on the history wars. That's all a backdrop to this. It was only a matter of time before somebody was going to make universities look at their own past. We'd been having for a long time, on again, off again, debates over what is this thing called a Confederacy? What about Confederate monuments? How should we be assessing America's relationship to that Civil War and all that flows from it? Not just those of us who wrote books about it, but it turned out the larger culture cared. There also was a maturity to the scholarship about slavery, folks. By the 90s and into the aughts and into this century, an incredible maturity or maturization of the scholarship about slavery. It became one of the most booming fields in all history, not just in the US, but all over the world. And that's one of the reasons I direct a center here on this, which was founded in 1998. Shouldn't be too far behind if universities are hiring more people and studying more of the history of slavery and abolition in various locales. Well, what about the universities themselves? There was a memory boom, a genuine cultural memory boom in America and many other places. In the 1990s, there had been an earlier memory boom that had to do especially with World War I and World War II. But the memory boom of the 90s now was the memory boom born of multiculturalism. Whose memory? Which story? How do you write textbooks now in America by the year 2000 or 2010? Whoa. And I'm a co-author on a textbook. I learned something about that. It's not easy. In fact, it's damn near impossible. And then we have these repeated kinds of reckonings with race especially, that often just force us to look at ourselves again. What happened in 2020? Well, everybody started issuing statements of support for George Floyd marches. Everyone had to write a statement after statement after statement, to the extent now that we kind of don't want to have to write statements anymore. We'd rather do something real. And then there are events that force these things. The end of the Cold War, which absolutely opened up whole worlds of histories. When Eastern Europe opened up, its history opened up. What did they do in Prague? In that Prague Spring, when the communist regime in Prague fell, what did they do? They went and emptied the National Museum of everything in it and started putting up new exhibits. That ain't our history. We're going to try to show you what is. In a world doing that, histories, or the past and memory, are really up for grabs now. 9/11, need I say, made everybody change their position, their perspective somehow on America's place in the world, at least for a while, and led to all kinds of seemingly forever wars. Charleston, in 2015, when Dylan Roof, that exceedingly disturbed maniac of a young man, that neo-Confederate, walked into Emmanuel AME Church and murdered 9 people in the basement in a prayer meeting. Shocked the country, shocked everybody. How could this happen? And a whole repositioning suddenly went on about all things Confederate, flags, monuments, and on and on and on and on and on. A little bit more later on how many Confederate monuments have actually come down. Charlottesville, Trumpism. The first university to do it was Brown. They initiated their study of themselves and their past, especially with the slave trade. I'll conclude here in just a second. And about 2001 and 2 and 3, their report came out in 05 or 06. We did a joint conference with Brown here shortly after I came here. Then came a whole series of other universities started studying their own past. University of Virginia was one of the leaders. And our current president, Maury McInnes, worked on that study. She wrote the introduction for their book. She is a scholar of actually the domestic slave trade. She's an art historian. She likes rooms like this. She's an art historian. And then many other universities began to step it up and step it up and step it up. Yale was late to the game. We started in 2020. We have a prehistory with this, particularly the name of John C. Calhoun on a college. And I was on a committee, the renaming committee for that back when, for my sins. But finally, it became impossible for universities not to examine their own past. And so we did. Now, you're reading this week the beginnings of our book. And I just want to conclude here with old Benjamin Silliman, born down in Fairfield County to one of the largest slaveholding families in Connecticut in the late 18th century. His statue is up there on Science Hill. Next time you're on Science Hill, go say hi to Silliman. He's right there next to what's that building called? He was professor of chemistry and natural history at Yale for decades. He pioneered, absolutely pioneered, bringing sciences into universities, here first. But he conducted a quite famous study of sugar production in Louisiana on a major federal grant that he got from Andrew Jackson. And by the way, Andrew Jackson owed him one. Andrew Jackson had a foster son, I think it was, who came to Yale but got thrown out. Got thrown out for, I don't know, something. And it's hard to get thrown out of Yale, right? But he got thrown out. And he got in touch with Silliman. They were old chums. Said, Professor Silliman, can you help me out here? Can you get my kid back in? And Silliman did. And in return, he got a major federal grant of money from the executive department. They didn't have such things, but Andrew Jackson invented one. And Silliman had an assistant, a man named Charles Upham Shepard, also a chemist, scientist, who helped him run this operation in Louisiana for a couple of years. And here was his basic instruction to Shepard. Open your eyes and ears to every fact connected with the actual condition of slavery everywhere, but do not talk about it. Hear and see everything, but say little. When we found that quote, which is in Silliman's letters, actually Hope McGrath, my colleague, found it. She sent it to me, and immediately I said, that's the epigraph on our book. And it is, if you look inside the cover. It sums up a good deal, not all of it, it sums up a good deal of the general collective memory and attitude about slavery and the past at Yale circa the 1830s when Silliman wrote that letter. Look at it, see it, study it, but don't publicly talk about it or deal with it. Times do change. Okay, sections start this week. Get signed up, please, immediately, because they're starting Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, or is it Thursday, Friday? And on Thursday, I'll take up this question of what is a legacy? And what kind of brink is this country on? But more on universities Thursday, too.